Welcome to Forum at 360. I'm Matt Miller. Tonight we're discussing reforms proposed by the Alaska Criminal Justice Commission. The commission was created in 2014 when state policymakers recognized major growth in prison population, high recidivism rates, and high costs of incarceration. The commission, made up of experts from a variety of disciplines and representatives from various branches of government, recently published a report with 21 recommendations to address problems in the system. And with us in the studio today are members of the commission. We have 4 members with us. At the far left is Greg Razo, chair of the commission and also a vice president of CIRI and a member of the Alaska Federation of Natives. Also with us is Jessee, chief executive officer of the Alaska Mental Health Trust Authority and former attorney for the Disability Law Center. Also, Kris is another member of the commission, and she's a lieutenant with the Juneau Police Department and also a vice president with the Alaska Peace Officers Association. And finally, we have with us Senator John Coghill, a Republican lawmaker from North Pole. He's a longtime Alaska lawmaker who's leading the push for reform in the legislature. Let's welcome them all to Forum at 360. Thank you for coming in, all 4 of you. Greg Razo, I wonder if you could start us out, if you could tell us a little bit about the purpose of the commission.
So the commission was created by a state statute, and it was called House Bill 64 originally. Governor Sean Parnell signed the crime bill that created the commission, and ultimately the commission was composed of members from the judiciary, law enforcement, from the victims community, victims and victims' rights community, myself as a member of the Alaska Native community, Mr. Jessee from behavioral health, the public defender, the attorney general. I think that's it. Department of Corrections commissioner, Department of Public Safety commissioner. So it was a very widely rounded, I'll say, commission with lots of viewpoints, but most importantly, lots of experience in criminal justice.
But what was the purpose? What was the idea here?
So the idea was a broad charge to review all of the Alaska criminal justice statutes, the rules, the policies that are affecting the criminal justice system, and take a look at where there were inefficiencies in the correction system, in all of the various systems that could affect criminal justice. And probably about 6 months into that, we began looking at what's known as justice reinvestment. And with the technical assistance of the Pew Trust, we were able to dig down into data about the Alaska criminal justice system. Because at the end of the day, the commission wanted to make recommendations that were based on data, that were policies that were soundly rooted in science. So we took a look at all of the drivers of what causes the prison population. We took a look at the systems in place that deal with issues such as substance abuse treatment and mental health treatment and how those could be improved. We looked at bail conditions, all of the factors that go into a person who is arrested being placed in prison. And then when they come out of prison, what are the supervision provisions that the Department of Corrections uses to supervise folks coming out of prison?
But what is the problem here? What are the issues being faced by the correction system at this point?
Well, the problem is huge. It's that the correction system in Alaska isn't correcting people, and as citizens, we're not getting a return on our investment. When 2 out of 3 people that come out of prison reoffend within 3 years, then we're not correcting anybody. We have such a high recidivism rate here in Alaska that it's just crying for the sort of review that the commission gave.
And so the prison population is also going up, you're spending more money on corrections?
Exactly. At the rate the prison population in Alaska is growing right now, next year we will run out of bed space. So it costs $300 million to operate the Department of Corrections approximately. Next year we'll run out of bed space. That means we'll need to look at ways of having people in prison out of state. We'll have to start examining the building of a new prison. The last prison cost well in excess of $250 million. So if we're looking at building a new prison in these times when money is so scarce, and we have to take a look at how are we doing? What kind of results are we getting in public safety? We're not getting very good results in public safety.
Senator Coghill, can you tell us how this got started in the legislature, the creation of the commission, and a look at some of these issues?
Sure. I've been on the Judiciary Committee most of the time that I've been in the legislature. And we have noticed that we've been ratcheting up crime levels, felonies for the most part. And we began to hear about these recidivism rates that were very troubling. They were going up. So in a bipartisan way, we worked together with several senators on our side. Senator French was one, and I was the chairman of the Judiciary. Well, he had been previously chair of Judiciary, so we got together. Senator Ellis and then Senator Fred Dyson. We got together and said, we really need a sentencing commission, which we had probably in the early 90s, but it fell off of favor, so to speak. So we asked ourselves, what would we ask a sentencing commission to look at? We knew that our sentencing was getting higher, and we were taking more discretion away from judges. And there's probably some good reasons for it. But we also knew our recidivism rate was going up higher. So we said, well, let's reestablish a commission to look at sentencing and recidivism. And as we began to look at it, we thought there's a much broader look at this than we had even thought ourselves. So let's find out how we can include people from a broad perspective and find out, is our public safety being used well, being treated properly? Is our sentencing in line? Are we treating people who are incarcerated properly? What happens when they get out of jail? Why is our recidivism rate well high? So we came up with about 12 things now that I'm thinking about it, that we charged a commission to do, and then we gave them some outcomes that we'd like to see. And so how do you put a commission together like this? And as Greg said, we looked as broadly as we could. We certainly wanted practitioners in the law, people who knew the system. We wanted people in the jail system. But we also wanted legislators who were from back home, and we needed victims advocates. We needed police officers that could tell us how that actually works. Put the commission together, but we also got warned that if you make a commission too big, you're never going to get a consensus-driven approach. You're never going to get things out of it. So we kept it small, and then we gave them short timelines to come up with recommendations. So this is the first year of recommendations in a big way, but they've come out with a couple of smaller recommendations over the last year or so, and which I think have found a way into the legislation. But this came out with a big report, 21 recommendations that really fit the need to say, okay, here's how you can look at sentencing, here's how you can look at, say, good time in jail, here's your pretrial issues, here are your community supervision issues, here's your probation parole issues that you can look at, that you can hold people accountable, but you can give them avenues of success. And I think that needs to be overstated, is that we wanted people to come from jail and be successful in society, productive as best they can. So those who will be productive will have avenues to do it. But those on pretrial, the same thing. We have more people staying in pretrial longer than ever before. They're taking up a lot of jail space, a lot of room for places where maybe you could get programs of approaches in there. As the officer said, we could actually do things in jail that will make them more productive and more healthy. So our pretrial population, even though many of them have their problems, we found out that through this commission that our bail has no respect to danger to society or ability to show up in court. It's just a payment fee. And if somebody shouldn't be in jail, if they're safe for society and they're going to show up for their court hearing, why hold them in jail? And so some of the recommendations are ways to do that. So probably for the first time, we're going to do a risk and a risk evaluation for those who are higher risk. There's an issue, and you can use bail to hold those risk factors. If they're low risk, Maybe there's a medium risk where monitoring by ankle monitoring works better. They don't lose their jobs. They're able to stay productive in society and still be held accountable. So the commission was charged with those things, and as you can see, I'm already pretty pleased with some of the things they put together. But Senate Bill 64 was the methodology, put it in motion. It did have 2 legislators on it, a House member and a Senate member. I'm the Senate member. We're non-voting, so we're kind of there to listen. And but they also expected, there was some expectation that these recommendations would find their way to the legislature, and that was one of the links, and I get to be one of the links.
And Lieutenant Sell, you're one of a couple law enforcement
That's
officers
correct.
on the commissioner. Can you tell us a little bit more about the makeup of it?
Sure. It was a very diverse group. We had defense attorneys, specialists from the mental health field, people who were there to talk about victims' rights. We were across the board, which, as you can imagine, led to some pretty interesting conversations, emphatic, shall we say, conversations about how to go about addressing certain things. Really, the only thing this group had in common walking in is that nobody was saying, I think things are going great. There wasn't one person saying that. So we were all coming at this from a perspective that we have to do better. We owe a better situation to the people that live in Alaska. And for me, I feel like I owe a better situation for the other officers on the street. We owe them a safer environment. We owe them a more productive career where they don't spin their wheels just arresting the same people over and over and over again, and then arresting the same families generation after generation after generation. So we do need to do a better job. And we worked really hard on it, and strange bedfellows came to agreements, and we looked at the science from other states. I'm not going to say that my work on the commission has made me popular. I actually feel the need to very specifically say that while I am a lieutenant at the Juneau Police Department and I am the vice president of the State Peace Officers Association, people from both of those groups looked at me and said, "What were you thinking?" And so I certainly have spent a good deal of 2016 in danger of not being invited to the Peace Officer Picnic this summer. But as we have continued to talk about theory and hammer out the details, we are getting closer because the science is out there and we're all trying to get to the same place. So we agree about more than we disagree about, but we are fine-tuning the details. When the legislation rolled out, even the people who were on the commission weren't saying, okay, this is perfect, please adopt this unaltered. We knew we had gone as far as we could with the size of the group we had. And it was time to use that as a starting point.
And Jessee, the senator and Greg Razo also mentioned some of the findings previously. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and expand on that?
Yeah, we focused our learning on 2 things. One was understanding what was happening in Alaska's criminal justice system, and then looking at what is the science behind crime, corrections, and reentry. For example, we learned that there's been an 81% increase in the pretrial population over the last 10 years. Huge driver for the prison population. And as the senator said, what we learned in the science is that actually there are tools that can assess pretrial risk pretty accurately. So you don't have to paint with a broad brush everyone that's coming into the pretrial system. We also learned, for example, that unsecured bail is just as effective as secured bail at getting people to show up in court and not commit crimes when they're on release.
For somebody who doesn't know that, what's the difference between unsecured and secured bail?
Well, secured bail means somebody has to actually put up assets that equal the amount of the bail, and so it's all at risk of forfeiture. And if you can't have relatives, or if you don't have any of those assets and you can't put them up as security for that bail, then you don't get released. And so that's the problem.
And that's contributing to the pretrial population.
Absolutely, because they can't make bail.
They're half of the pretrial population, folks that are trying to make bail but can't get out of prison. Unconvicted people, they haven't been convicted of any offense yet. They're just in prison because of bail.
That's the secured part. The unsecured part is let you go free if you're a low risk. You're free to go back to work, to your family. If you don't show up to court, then the bail is on you.
Any other particular findings of note?
Well, in the incarcerated population, which has increased 14% over the last decade, what the science told us is that in many cases, prison sentences are not any more effective at reducing recidivism than other release programs that would put people back in the community, like electronic monitoring or other sorts of supervision tools. We also learned, for example, that when prisoners are ready for release, that if there's planning for their release, that's often more effective. We also learned that in many cases, longer prison sentences aren't any more effective at reducing recidivism than shorter sentences for certain crimes. So all that starts to be the basis to make some recommendations for the sentencing arena and other parts of the incarceration picture. On post-release, where people go into the community, and there's been a 27% increase in the incarceration population, we learned several things. We learned, for example, that if you focus your supervision on the most dangerous, at-risk people coming out of corrections, you'll have your best bang for the buck. We also learned that if people have access to housing, employment, and support for recovery, that their chances of recidivating are much less. We also learned that if you can mete out small but immediate consequences for technical violations, instead of putting them back into jail or prison for an extended period of time.
Like a probation violation?
Like a probation violation, that those short, certain consequences are much more effective at getting behavioral change than going ahead and putting them back into incarceration for long periods of time.
And you're spending more money on more beds.
And you're spending more time on more beds. And so each phase, the pretrial, the during incarceration, and the post-release, each one of those phases was then, we were able to start to fashion recommendations on how to reduce the prison population in those areas.
And do we have too many low-level, what some people would say low-level offenders taking up the prison population at this point?
In 2014, 3/4 of the people going to prison were going to prison for nonviolent offenses. We're basically spending money, a lot of money, on non-dangerous, non-serious offenses, and they take up each bed for a year in prison is $54,000, $141 a day, and I would say that the commission just, fundamentally, we are people that work in the criminal justice system and understand that the same thing happens every day. You see the same people coming into court day after day, the same police officers testifying, all for disorderly conduct, for theft in the 4th degree, for these lower level crimes, and people go to jail and they come back out, and guess what? Nothing has happened to make them their behavior less criminal in jail. It hasn't treated their substance abuse, which may be the core problem that they face, or the mental health disability. And so consequently, we just do this over and over. The judges that were on our commission, there was the Superior Court and the District Court and the Supreme Court. And I would say that the District Court, probably most of all, where these low-level offenses wind up, they just see thousands of offenses, and they see the same people coming in over and over again with absolutely no treatment happening to them and nothing to address their behaviors.
How did we get here, though? I mean, did this start 80 years ago with the advent of presumptive sentencing and more resources to law enforcement and prosecutors?
We got tough on crime for a long time. We really did, and we created a presumptive sentencing system, which we put in place to make sure that offenders that were felony level offenders were going to have a certain amount of time in jail for the offense that they committed. And so that scheme was put in place. And then a Supreme Court decision changed that, and they had to go back and relook 10 years ago at presumptive sentencing. And when they took the second look at it, they modified it a little bit with the intention, the legislature changed it, with the intention of not making sentences longer, but the effect was to make the sentences almost double over the last 10 years. And that's an unintended consequence, clearly, if you look at the law, but that's what is happening in Alaska right now.
So a judge may have more range as far as a sentence, but his hands are tied. He can't do anything outside that range except for extraordinary circumstances.
The sentences just keep getting longer and longer and longer.
Well, and there's more dimensions to it than that. When you look at the prevalence of mental illness with people who are getting arrested, decades ago there was a decision at the federal level that people were not going to be institutionalized at the rate they were being put into facilities. And there was a theory that mentally ill people need to stay in their communities. Well, the communities have proven over the last 30 years that they don't know how to handle the mentally ill. The people with serious mental illness can't just go back to their families and be fine. They end up on the streets, they end up committing crimes. They're often more likely to be victimized than to victimize other people, but some of them become very dangerous, and we don't address that aspect. And you combine that with substance abuse addiction, and you have 80% of the criminal population. And that's not a population that you can punish out of their problem. You have to actually treat what's going on. Sometimes at the same time, they're being punished, but it's not a situation that you can solve with one tool. Even though there's something that feels good about saying, you know, when someone breaks the rules, we're going to put them away for the maximum amount of time, no frills, and we're going to treat them very harshly, and then they won't do that again. That falls apart as soon as you get into the substance addicted and mentally ill sections of the population, because they're not analyzing cause and effect like that. So it doesn't work with such a large portion of the population.
And we can't build our way out of the problem, new prison, and in order to comply with the Cleary settlement, I imagine that is something that lawmakers want to try to avoid, is sending more offenders out of state for incarceration. That's also more expensive, right?
Well, actually, it would be less expensive than incarcerating them in Alaska, that's for sure. Let me just say this, and following the lieutenant, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to
I've been called much
promote
worse,
you.
but yes, lieutenant is fine.
Look, we're dealing with people. There are some people you want to punish because they have done bad, horrible, bad things. They've really violated somebody's life or even taken their life. There are some people that just need to be held accountable because they got addicted on drugs or they misused alcohol, and they just need to be held accountable. I don't know that they're bad people, but they're making bad decisions, and I think with a little bit of accountability, those decisions would change. Some can do it after one trip through, some can do it after 2 trips through, but there are people that can be given opportunities to be productive in life. There are people who should never be given that opportunity because they did some heinous things. But our prison population is full of people who have made bad decisions, and because of the way we've had the system built, we only trap them into, you can only do bad things, because we've not given them avenues to succeed in life. We've literally put scarlet letters on them. We've made it harder for them to get to work. We made it harder for them to drive. We've had probation officers weary them through technical violations because they can't meet the demands or because they relapse and they can't produce. So there's an accountability, I think, that will work in a lot of people's lives that programmatic approaches will work for, but it's an investment rather than taking away. And so I wouldn't call it necessarily punishment so much as there's an accountability factor. There are some people that are going to be punished. I mean, and I don't know that I want people who just need to be held accountable sitting side by side with somebody who has done something so bad, and now we're going to make them associate with each other, where that association could only make it worse. So I think
there's really a very small number of people, though, that spend the rest of their life in prison after they commit a crime. You know, the most serious offenders, the murderers do that sometimes. But for the vast majority of people that go into prison, they come out of prison. And and then they reoffend by having some sort, or they get put back into prison through a probation or a parole violation after they've completed their term and paid their price. They're on probation, but they're on probation with restrictions that sets them up for failure. So 26% of the people in prison are in prison for technical probation violations. And what I'm talking about, for example, is the case of a man that I spoke with about 3 weeks ago from Brevig, Mission, who was released from prison after doing his crime, but he could not get his treatment in the location where he comes from. So he's doing his treatment in Anchorage. And as a part of his release to a halfway house, he was required to go out and seek employment. Perfectly correct requirement. But this is a man from Brevig, Mission, who has absolutely no idea how to use a bus system. He has no money for taxi fare. He doesn't have a job. And so he finally figured out how to get to the part of Anchorage where he needed to go to for his job interview. And then he couldn't figure out how to get back to the halfway house in time. So he was 2 hours late. And for that 2 hours late, he was violated and spent 4 more months in prison. That's the problem that we're talking about.
Before we move on here, we of course have 4 members of the commission here, but we also have essentially a 5th member of the commission. And earlier we talked with your fellow commission member, Brenda Stanfill, who is, among her many other positions or duties, she's also with the Interior Alaska Center for Nonviolent Living in Fairbanks. And she had these comments about whether maximum or longer sentences imposed for some convictions is really effective. Let's take a look.
From a victim standpoint, we go on feelings a lot. I mean, I've been victimized in different ways. You know, I think we all have, and we remember how it felt when we got up and our kid's bike was gone that they just got for their birthday and they're heartbroken, and you think, I hope when they catch him he gets a year in jail, you know, but really, is that the reality based of how you stop somebody in the long run to make our community safer by having the maximum penalty? And so we did try to take feelings out of it. And from the victim advocate seat, I can tell you that was very hard. There were some days that the feelings were overwhelming me quite a bit. And I had to step back and say, what does the research say? If the research says that 30 days is where we get our best results, and we're keeping him in for 45, that 15 days is really expensive. And what are we really gaining for that extra 15 days in terms of the cost to the state versus the safety of the public? I know that for each person who's been a victim of crime, we tend to look at, you know, if they didn't get the maximum, they didn't get enough. I mean, you feel that vulnerability of how they made you feel exposed or whatever it was that happened. If we set up our system for that, we really would not be able to afford it. That's just the reality. And we have to look at what our system is really supposed to be there for, I believe, and that comes back to, as I said, doing the results-based, doing not the emotional, and trying to come back to figuring it out in a way that makes sense in the long term.
So it sounds like a little bit about what both of you have mentioned earlier, that just because they're longer sentences, it does not necessarily help the issue of recidivism. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. And it's also what Greg said too about the vast majority of these inmates are going to return to the community. And not the technical violations, but real recidivism. Virtually every act of recidivism creates another victim. So while you think you're protecting victims by keeping people locked up more often and for longer periods of time, in fact, inadvertently, you're creating more victims in the long run because your recidivism rate remains unacceptably high.
Now, Senator Coghill, the bill that has just been introduced incorporates some of the recommendations from the commission. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. There were 21 recommendations that came from the commission in about 5 different areas. The pretrial area, the sentencing area, the probation, parole, community supervision, and probably some of the reinvestment issues that we'll see kind of formulate as the budget grows. So of those 21 recommendations in those areas, I think all of them have found their way into the bill, probably not exactly as recommended from the commission, and I'll tell you why. The commission looked at it from a very high level, and it was consensus driven. When you get it down into the actually writing it in the law, you'll find out that there's incongruencies from one section of the law to the other, and we had to start matching those up. And then it's a political process, and that is politics is part of what we do in the legislature. And there are some people right now that feel like if we loosen up some of these areas, that victimization is going to go higher. And so in the committee that it's in right now, that was been the main focus. So there were some things that the recommendation came from the committee that had to be modified a little bit. For example, on some of the domestic violence and sexual assault areas, there was a little lowering of some of the penalties. That it wasn't a total lowering, it didn't decriminalize it, but it lowered some of the penalties, gave them an opportunity to go into a program. That was pretty well rejected in the committee that we're in now. And so there was probably things like that that were dealt with, making sure that if a victim was required notification, that it was happened well, it happened properly. I'm trying to think of all the things that were amended in it, but you'll see a bill come from the State Affairs Committee, and the process is going to be to go to the Judiciary Committee. So the cornerstone of public safety with regard to victims was probably what was happening in State Affairs. The sentencing, recidivism issues, the pretrial and post-trial issues are going to be dealt with in Judiciary Committee, and then the reentry part and the reinvestment part will happen in Finance. So that will be probably the next 6 weeks, full on taking on all those issues.
Lieutenant Sell, I'm kind of curious to get your perspective on this. What is your viewpoint, or the viewpoint of your colleagues who may be working patrol or investigations, and when it comes to a particular case and an offender eventually is convicted of a crime, and now the possibility that such lower penalties are in place for such sentences? Does that give any of your colleagues pause?
Oh yes. I mean, instinctively, we recoil from the thought of less hard prison time for people that we convict. And that's a really natural response to that situation. But when you look at where that's gotten us, when I walk through the jail and walk through the prisons, as I have done with this commission and I have done as a police officer, people are watching TV and playing cards. They're talking to each other about how to get away with crimes. They're just kind of coasting along on the taxpayers' money. And some of these people have really serious issues going on in their lives. They have addictions, they have mental health issues. Some aren't literate, some don't have job skills to go be productive, to live a law-abiding lifestyle. And we have positive and negative tools to force them to confront what their issue is that has them in the criminal arena. And if they won't address that driver, then they don't have the freedom. They stay in those beds. So there's a natural frustration that comes, I think, amongst a lot of law enforcement when you talk about there being less hard days in the prison. But we also know that when we're not addressing why people commit crimes and they continue to cycle in and out of prison, they become more and more dangerous. They become more and more criminalized. And they can become some very scary people. So if there was a way to take some people at the beginning and divert them from that path, ultimately that makes us safer. It's not intuitive to put people in jail for less time to get better results. And I understand the stomach ache that gives so many of us to even talk about that. But we need to get to a point where we're thinking about what our results are, not what's being handed down as just part of the process. Where are we getting in the long run? And when you talk about that large overview, so many of us from different areas shared that vision that when people came into the correction system, if we could actually find out why that person is committing crimes, and then relentlessly, I'm not talking about in a fun way, I'm talking about relentlessly going after that behavior and that thinking with both positive and negative consequences. Some of the positive will be days out of jail, but there's also a lot that that person has to be doing when we get serious about addressing why somebody's committing crimes. And it's not watching TV and playing cards and learning more about being a criminal. It is getting job skills and addressing mental health issues and addressing substance abuse and committing with the person so that we can actually, to whatever way we can motivate someone, partner with them in them becoming safe, law-abiding citizens. And I'm talking about using really serious sanctions and some positive rewards to get that person to partner with doing better when they're out of prison.
Now, the commission basically came up with a figure of, what, $424 million in savings for the corrections system over the next 10 years. And I wasn't quite sure of the numbers and projected decline in population, about, what, at least 15 to 20%? Am I incorrect there?
Yeah, I think it's over 20%.
Okay. So what about the next phase of that? What about addressing those drivers, dealing with a person's mental health or substance abuse issues? Is that coming up later in the process? Jessee?
Well, it's part of the process. That's part of the reinvestment piece of this, that like any company, if you took all your profits in the first year and you didn't invest anything else in the company, you'd do really well for 1 year and then you'd be out of business. Smart companies reinvest part of their profit back in building the business. That's exactly what criminal justice reinvestment is about. It's about taking some of those savings and reinvesting them in programs that we know will be successful. For example, mental health court is a good example, where people with mental illness get repeatedly caught up in the criminal justice system, usually over petty misdemeanors, defrauding an innkeeper by not paying for a meal, or trespass, or disturbing the peace. And in the mental health courts, they get connected with a case manager who works with them on getting housing, on getting employment, on staying into treatment. One interesting aspect of the mental health court is the judges actually speak directly to the defendants and engage them in a conversation about, how are you doing? How's your job coming? How's your apartment? I was in one mental health court a few months ago where a woman had become very stable in the community. She was taking her meds, she had a job, she had an apartment that she kept, and the judge says, you are doing so well, you don't need to come back next month. You can come back in 3 months. And this woman was crestfallen. She said, are you sure I can't come back next month? Because we had turned the whole justice system experience around to where she saw it as a positive experience that was helping her build a real life in the community rather than getting her caught up in jail and prison.
But how effective are these programs, the mental health court, the therapeutic court? How good are they at keeping people from going back in and after they reoffend?
The data is really positive. I mean, huge reductions in the number of days in Alaska Psychiatric Institute, big reductions in the number of jail days. This works.
Some of it is incentives, though. For example, people getting out of jail, they were maybe there for a drug-related or an alcohol-related crime. Let's just say right now, they are said, go to a program and we'll give you probation X, no risk or needs assessment at all. And so we're trying to ramp that up a little better so that when there's an exit plan, it starts inside the jail, gives them tools that will help them go into society. And no, people aren't all the same now. Mental health issues being what they are, there's a range. But there are some people who get caught one time and held accountable, they're not coming back. They're not going to do it again. There are some people get caught 2 times. They figure out after accountability, and there are some drugs that get really hooked into you. Maybe you have to do 2 or 3 times. But if somebody's willing to do that, I think there's a willing investment to be made to say, we'll help you move into a more productive life. But there's still an accountability. So it could be an ankle monitor, it could be shorter times on probation, it could be a variety of different tools. But getting a program that fits their need, I think, is probably one of the things that we have to do better at.
Well, how would you alleviate, though, the public's worries that maybe their own safety would be compromised from such methods, such as the ankle monitor and shorter probation and that sort of thing?
There's never a 100% guarantee. But that's where I was talking about these risk and needs assessments. There's the evaluation of while they're maybe incarcerated. There's an evaluation of what happened in their trial, the way that they were arrested. All that goes into the factor of the public safety. Because I can tell you, in the legislature, there's not a lot of willingness to make a less safe society. So those accountability measures have to be appropriate to what's going on. But there's a recognition that the misdemeanors could be held accountable very, very differently than just putting them in jail. So I think there's a willingness at this point to take some of the proven practices that have happened throughout the United States, apply them as best we can in Alaska, knowing that we're both geographically and economically diverse, but give us some tools to help us do that. And I think the Commission came up with a fairly good rounded look at both the pretrial and the community supervision elements.
At the end of the day, it has to be evidence-based. Whatever we decide to do in terms of treatment or in terms of the criminal justice system should be evidence-based. And following, justice reinvestment, to get to that evidence-based portion of determining, if this model doesn't work, then the state shouldn't be paying money for it. That ability to see how the evidence plays out on an investment in treatment or what have you.
Now, as Senator Coghill mentioned here, you're not exactly reinventing the wheel here. This is some of these methods, some of these techniques have already been done elsewhere.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's the key point. This is not an Alaska-based innovation that's happening right now. Justice reinvestment and criminal justice reform is happening across the United States and in the federal criminal justice system. And it's because we have evidence now. We know what works and what does not work. And there's evidence, there's statistics, there's studies by eminent scientists that show that, guys far smarter than any of us, that show that this actually seems to work. It reduces criminal behavior.
The very reason we put the commission together is because the legislature meeting for 90 days or 120 days, however you view it, a committee can deal with one issue at a time. But we saw things happening all over the United States where they were turning the recidivism rate down and actually having less people commit crimes. How did that happen? And so we looked at Texas and Tennessee and Oklahoma, and we looked at Hawaii. We looked at places that had done things that changed the paradigm. And so we tried to gather the best information we could and say, how does that fit into Alaska? And so we had the Pew people come here and actually go into our jails and get all the data out and spread it out in front of us as best they knew how, showing how we fit with what other people were doing. And if you do this, you can change this element. And even though people aren't statistics, it's really a proven practice that shows that people have actually changed. And so I think there's great hope in that for us.
And some of the states that have made the most progress, like Texas, are hardly, bleeding heart liberal states that are soft on crime. But when they started to implement these strategies and they saw the results, they knew they were on the right track.
If any members of our audience had any questions for members of the Commission, you're welcome to step up to the microphone and ask your question, and we have one already here.
Hi. I have a question for you. What do you do with somebody who's been given every opportunity and chance and who's been a part of the presumptive sentencing and the long sentencing therapeutic court, ankle monitor, third party, RSAT, PACE program? Like, what do you do with someone like that shows improvement but just still doesn't get it? And then, they still have probation time, so do you just put them in there to take up a bed to do their time because there's nothing else that seems possible to do with that person? So what?
I think from a legislative perspective, the answer is if they will not perform a healthier lifestyle, then they're going to finish out a sentence. And if they will go out and reoffend again after doing that, then they're coming back in. So there are incorrigible people who just cannot be encouraged in the right direction. So yes, I think what you give them the opportunity. If they can't live up to a successful opportunity, then either they're going to complete a sentence or they're coming back for another one.
Yeah. You're not unusual, though. When I go into an audience and start talking about issues like this, and I ask people to raise their hands if they or a family member has been involved with the Alaska criminal justice system, almost everybody in the audience raises their hands. So it's just a part of the way we live here in Alaska. We can change that.
What if this person, if they show improvement and they get more out of every situation and benefit that they've been given, but sometimes people just don't get it. You know, they have substance abuse issues along with mental health issues, and treatments aren't cutting it, and so that's just that. They just go sit in jail and deal with it.
The only way for people to be safe around them, if they're committed to not changing, is for them to be in jail. And I'm not a particularly huggy person, though. In participating in this, I have been accused of being part of a hug a thug program. That's not how I see myself. I actually feel like I'm pretty blunt about what people need to do, and it could be for that person the only way to be safe is for them to be in prison, and I think those are dollars well spent if that's what it takes.
I think it depends upon how dangerous they are, because
They're a nonviolent offender that just relapses all the time.
right, and that's a big problem. There are going to be some people, I've known people who got wrapped up in heroin, and it took them 3-4 times to go through a treatment before they got it. And so I've seen that. I've seen some people get it the first time through. There are some people, though, that they are satisfied to not excel, and probably are more likely to offend. But as long as they're not dangerous, then I don't know that jail is the best place for them, but accountability certainly is going to be a part of their life. Right. It's just going to have to be. So however that can be worked out, and I'm game for whether there's a program, they can't go to a drug court, so there's going to be an accountability measure if they keep violating. There just is. I mean, jail may not be the best if they're not dangerous, but accountability is going to be a part of their life.
I'm sorry.
Well, they may need intensive case management. They may need supportive housing where there's actually supports in the housing and they're checked on every day. You can provide a lot of supports in the community for much less than the $141 a day it takes to keep them in prison.
And when I say dangerous, I don't mean just violent danger. You know, thievery is still a violation. You know, you start taking from people and it's not a good thing. So that accountability is still got to be there.
A burglary is one of the most violating experiences people can have, and that's real, and we can't discount that as being nonviolent. It's an incredible violation. So yes, if they're continuing to do things, then they do need to be held accountable at that level and possibly isolated from the community.
Okay, well, honestly, I was speaking for myself. I've had all these issues and I've done all this stuff, and I show promise and I have a job and I do try harder, and sometimes it just seems like sometimes you don't get it, you know? And you get all these opportunities and you want to do better, and it just sometimes, you know, and so I'm curious if there's like something else we can do to benefit at the same time hold people accountable during that situation.
Well, I'm going to talk a little off the record here, off the topic. There are a lot of people that are support-based people. I'm a Christian, so I would go to a church. I think faith-based is going to be a big part of it. I would encourage you to associate yourself with people who will be positive with you, because I think that's how we get it, personally. I mean, people help people. That's what we do. And this penal system is meant to be an accountability system at the best level we can do it. Some of them has to be honest to goodness punishment, because that is worthy of the crime. Some of it is accountability, even at the lowest levels. But for those who, like yourself, as you freely admit, my suggestion is find people that you can associate with that will be that group that will help you be healthier.
Yeah, supports. You know, sure, prison is meant to show community condemnation and to isolate an offender, but it's also meant to reform a person. Reformation is part of the statute in sentencing, and that's the part that we sometimes forget about, in how we sentence now. But for you individually, having your supports around you will be the best thing for you. And do not give up hope, because things change. Things always change. That's one thing I've learned in my life, is that, you know, everything changes over time, and you never know when that golden ring that is going to pull you out of your current situation and take you someplace else will happen for you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
Questions?
Appreciate your comment.
So my question is, does anything inside of Senate Bill 91 address the third party or the electronic monitoring? Because they seem to be nonprofits, and their effect about keeping people on monitors longer or restricting their ability to have mobility even though they're on monitoring?
The answer is yes. What you're going to see, one of the recommendations that came from the commission is a pretrial services group that will do some electronic monitoring, and then some electronic monitoring that will be available on probation parole. It still will probably allow for some contracting. The pretrial services would be a government organization inside Department of Correction. On the other side, it may be contracting. It is yet to be hammered out, but the answer is yes, the issue is being dealt with, but I don't say that it's totally defined yet.
The problem is, in our statutes, we've made the requirement of third-party custodian an automatic requirement in the courts. And it's because the courts are doing their very best to keep the public safe. So they impose a third-party requirement, they impose bail requirements, they impose other conditions of release, and they do it using their own judgment, but not without the assistance of any sort of tool to guide them on what the best policy is going to be. So there's no risk assessment when somebody comes in front of the judge. The judge just kind of eyeballs them, finds out from the prosecutor what the story is, hears from the defendant if he wants to talk or she wants to talk, and then they give their best guess on what's going to be a reasonable bail. And there's tools that we have now. It's a modern society with tools. We can use those tools.
And sometimes you can have too many tools. Yeah. If you load somebody up with bail, a cash bail, third-party custodian, electronic monitoring, 24/7 sobriety testing, and all these things, well, if these guys were smart enough to figure out how to get all that put together, they probably wouldn't be in jail in the first place. So at some point, you have to match these conditions to the actual objective risk that the person presents in the community.
Yes.
We're almost out of time, but we have time for one more question.
It's my lucky day. First of all, thank you. Each one up there has impacted my life personally very, very deeply. My question is on the reinvestment piece. I need to wrap my mind around exactly how this is going to go down, because we have to have recovery supports that are effective, that are community-wide, breaking stigma. We know that I think it's 90% of people get out of prison, right, eventually. So regardless of the length of sentencing, we have people coming out with substance use disorders. What a courageous woman. You know, I love Jenny, and these are the kind of women that I see every single day. And it feels like all of our resources, we have tons of resources, we burn our bridges at a lot of them when we're in active addiction. But to continue loving people and having those recovery supports available is crucial. Otherwise, we're all going to go back to jail, and everyone will say this is a big failure after putting all this time and effort into this bill and everything we're trying to do here. So my question is, what are those supports that are going to happen with reentry, both pre, during, and after? We're doing reentry supports right now, and sometimes it feels like because we're not necessarily at the level of what some people might think, that we're kind of disregarded a lot of times. And I think that every piece matters, and we're making a huge difference in our community. How can we elevate that, and what's going to happen with that reinvestment piece? And is it going to be like not just saying it and actually doing it? How is that going to work? Thank you.
Well, it's going to work in there's three different ways. The pretrial we've already talked about, so I won't give a lot of time to that. In probation parole, there'll be probably your ability to earn good time if you do programs. So there'll be incentives to go into programs that are especially fitted to your particular issue. And then beyond that, the savings that we can give, I don't know that it's been totally figured out yet, but my aim is to how to get the dollar to follow the person as much as we can. Rather than picking winners and losers in the various different programs, how to get that dollar to follow that need as much as possible. And that's going to have to be probably through a funding source that can be applied to. And we're working on that. It's a work in progress, but keep with us on that.
I'm sorry, Senator, but we're out of time. Thanks a lot for all four of you for coming in. It's been a great discussion, and actually I wish we had another hour to talk about this. Greg Razo, Jeff Jessee, Lieutenant Kris, and Senator John Coghill, thanks a lot for coming by. Appreciate it. I am Matt Miller. Thanks for joining us on Forum at 360.
Funding for Forum at 360 comes from Rainbow Foods of Juneau.